Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. Every 10 years, regular as clockwork, thousands of people fan out all over the country to ask questions of Indians about all manner of things from the language spoken to their income. This is the government census, which has been on since 1872 and has become a great tool for the government in shaping its policies. As per the uninterrupted run, the next census should have taken place in 2021, but it did not, and it still has not, which is breaking the run for the very first time. The COVID pandemic is supposed to have delayed it, but is that really so? I reached out to Pramit Bhattacharya, a journalist who has written extensively on the subject, to ask what are the implications of this delay. Bhattacharya, who has studied in Guwahati, Mumbai and London, is one of the acknowledged commentators on data and is now a columnist for Mint and Hindustan Times. He joins me today to talk about the delay in holding the census and on the broader problems with India's statistical system. Pramit Bhattacharya, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
Pramit, start by telling us what exactly is the census and why was it started and what do the governments look for?
Yeah, so the census is basically a head count of all the people in the country, the entire population. And apart from the head count of each state, district, block, etc., you also get details at a household level of the kind of houses people live in, economic condition of those houses, whether the floor is made of cement or kacha, etc., the assets they own, whether they have a two-wheeler, four-wheeler, etc. You get data on languages, mother tongue of people, additional languages that they speak. And you also have a sense of the occupational categories of workers. So what does the head of the household do? In which kind of industry does he or she work in? So it provides a comprehensive database of socioeconomic characteristics, which is unmatched by any other database in the country or any country for that matter. And in any modern economy, the census basically acts as a bedrock over which other databases are built. For instance, if a sample survey is launched, then the census is the foundational database on the basis of which a sample survey will be designed. So almost every other database in the country, directly or indirectly, sort of depends on the census. So that's its sort of importance in the country. And it started in 1872. The British basically formalized the system of data collection, A, to control the natives, but B, also to show how beneficial their Raj was. And the first census did not cover the entire country, but it covered large parts, happened over years. And in 1881, we really began the sort of decennial censuses covering the entire country and continued almost in an unbroken run till 2011. The next census was supposed to happen in 2021, but that run has now been broken.
Yeah, we'll come to that. Why were the British interested in gathering all this information?
So one of the main triggers was this Sepoy Mutiny, or the first war of independence in 1857, which sort of threw a challenge to the British Raj, and it led to a lot of questions about how the British were governed, whether they would be able to sort of control the natives, so to speak. And that led to sort of this demand for more data, more sort of information on the kind of social composition, religious composition, on the kind of economic status of people in the country. And that sort of led them to think of ways in which such information could be collected. And there was a statistical commission appointed sometime in 1861 or 62 that for the first time sort of raised this possibility of having a countrywide census. There was similar census already in some of the provinces. And its recommendation of collecting data in specific formats and developing a sort of full census of A, population, and B, factories was what led the British to establish a sort of modern census operation in the country and a modern statistical system in the country.
After independence, the Indian government obviously saw value in it and continued. But did they make any changes in questionnaires?
Yeah, definitely. So during the British era, the census was a once in a 10-year operation. There was no permanent sort of body. Census commissioners were appointed, then they went to some other postings, and the staff were recruited anew after every 10 years. After independence, that changed. We had a Registrar General of India Act sometime in the late 1950s, 1957, if I'm mistaken. Ashok Mitra was the first RGI. And he introduced a number of changes in the questions in 1961. The kind of verification that was required to ensure that the census data was robust was completely overhauled. And in fact, he presented the entire plan of how this was going to be done at a cabinet meeting, where he had to convince Mahalanobis, who expressed his doubts over this and who was a big fan of sample surveys. And only after meeting all those tests was this rolled out. And the way we know census today is largely a reflection of the work put in those years between 1951 to 61, primarily by Ashok Mitra.
What were the specific kind of changes that were made?
So the economic classifications were earlier not detailed. They were very broad. So for instance, whether you're working in agriculture or industry, so on. In that census, it was far more detailed. Question on languages also became far more detailed. These are the two major changes I can remember offhand about the 61 census. So on the economic side, it made a definite break from the past. You had far more data on jobs on occupational categories.
So after this 61, all the censuses that were carried out, what use did the government put them to? Some examples.
So, for instance, just to give example from the recent past, this entire sort of policy on sort of preventing sort of sex determination tests, the debate on that and the policy sort of response that should happen after that came after the 91 sort of census showed that, there's a sort of decline in the sex ratio, and this 2001 census sort of confirmed that this was continuing, and it has become alarming by then. And that led to, again, a renewed sort of emphasis on enforcing this. What are the other sort of preventive measures we can take to ensure that the girl child is safe? So this is just one example of direct policy sort of impact of the census data. But there are various other examples. So just if you go to, for instance, any district collector's office, you speak to any district collector in any district of the country, the census handbook at the district level is almost like a Bible for that person, because if he has to allocate funds to a particular block or particular sub-district, then one of the key criteria that he or she would be using would be its population, its sort of economic status, and all that data is there in the census. No other survey provides that kind of granular detail up to the village level. So even whether a village has school, whether a village has Pakka road, all that data comes in something called a primary census abstract, which again is very useful not just for researchers and academics, but also for policymakers, because that is like a directory of villages with all the associated infrastructure and economic assets linked to it, and there's no other comparable database. So that is again a direct sort of policy sort of toolbook. The third is that almost everything that we know about the Indian economy and the socio-economic sort of database of the country comes from surveys, large scale surveys, say the National Family Health Survey or the National Sample Survey. All of these surveys are based on a sampling frame, which basically means that there's a list of households or a map of different areas, and you select a sample as a part, a subset, a small subset from that at random. But to be able to do that, you first need that full list. That full list basically comes from the census. And when you use an outdated census to draw those samples, because many of your stratification, the way you divide the entire population is based on population. So villages of a certain population size are clubbed together to form a certain strata or a certain section during sampling. Now, when the population size, of course, changes over time, and therefore you have decimal censuses after every 10 years to update that. If that updation stops, then it impacts the reliability of almost every other database in the country, including all the surveys that we rely.
So the last one you said was 2011, and now 2021 would have been the first census of the Modi government. Am I right?
Yes.
Why has it got delayed? Is it poor planning?
So initially, it was the pandemic. They had actually done some pre-tests of the questionnaire in 2019. So the planning was there. So initially it was the pandemic and also their attempt to sort of link it with the NRC. That created sort of backlash.
Just tell us what the NRC is and how does it fit in with this context?
Yeah. So the NRC, or the National Register of Citizens, has a specific sort of context in Assam, also the state I come from, where there has been a long-standing demand of Assamese sub-nationalists that there was an NRC done in 1951 at the time of the 1951 census. Basically, some additional details apart from what was collected in the country was collected in Assam to examine the bona fides of local residents, whether that resident has been living there for long, whether that resident is what was termed as an original inhabitant, OI, or not, and some other such details. And there was a demand that that kind of an exercise should be repeated and their household level register should be developed so that anyone who has migrated after that or their descendants can be identified. And then it can be used for various kinds of domicile policies, reservation policies, etc. And if that person is proved to have come after 1971, which is the cutoff date for citizenship in Assam, that person can be deported. But to do this, they demanded that either you have to trace a link with someone in the 1951 census or you have to find additional documents, etc., which became a big hassle for people there, especially if you're not educated, do not have education documents from a pre-71 period. For many poor people, many illiterate people, it became huge hassle, and especially minority groups felt harassed and left out. And also the local bureaucracy, the way these things sort of implement, there are a lot of challenges and there's a lot of subjectivity in what was supposed to be an objective process. And it created a lot of discontent. And that's the reason even now the Assam government, which is led by BJP, has not actually been able to finalize that NRC even today.
And so you are saying that there was an attempt to link NRC and the census.
Yes. So when the 2021 census, this Assam NRC happened even before the census, but when the 2021 census was, even before it was supposed to happen, the Home Minister Amit Shah said in election rallies that there will be a nationwide NRC now, similar to what we had done in Assam. And that really set off fears, especially among Muslim groups, that this might be an occasion to sort of target them, disenfranchise them. And we saw a range of protests also among students, who felt this was discriminatory and this could sort of lead to sort of harassment and eventual disenfranchisement of minority groups. You saw, if you remember, those anti-NRC CA protests happening across B schools, across university campuses, sometime in the late 2019.
Yes.
And 2020 was when the household listing was supposed to happen, which is the pre-census phase. So census happens actually in two phases. The first phase is the house listing phase, where just the data on the household characteristics are taken. So what is the material of the house? Who is the household head and the number of household members? Just that. All the language data, the other occupational status data, all the detailed data is taken later during the actual census. But the house characteristics and how many households are there in a particular area, those details are collected in a previous phase because it enables the census authorities to plan the next phase better. So it's called the house listing phase. So that house listing phase was supposed to happen in mid-2020 and there was notification issued also for that. The list of questions for the house listing was prepared. It is there even now, I think, on the census site. Or if they've removed it now, I don't know, but I had downloaded it at that time. So I remember I'm seeing it. This was supposed to happen in 2020. And even before that, we found, and we reported this in Mint, that there were areas in two instances in West Bengal and in Andhra Pradesh, in two separate instances, where NSS workers were blocked from collecting data because the respondents said that, they have come to collect migration data or they have come to collect data on our antecedents and we won't allow. So this was around the time this anti-NRC protests were going on. Then statisticians expressed the fear that even the house listing exercise might get affected. But before all this could sort of be tested on the ground, the COVID pandemic hit and that sort of derailed the entire thing. And post that, NSS surveys have started. So we do not find that kind of anti or NRC linked sort of anxiety anymore. The Prime Minister himself, I think, had declared at one point that no, this census and this should be delinked or gave a statement to that effect. So I think the NRC related fears may be less now than it was in 2020.
Yeah.
So that I do not think would be a major reason why they are continuing to sort of postpone this. But that was one of the reasons then in 2020 why that might have been affected. But the experience of surveys since then show that there may not be a blanket suspicion of all surveys, especially if you declare the outset that no, this is not going to be an Assam-like exercise.
We'll be right back after this short break. Welcome back to the wire talks.
Pramit, the lockdown started in March 2020
Yes.
and loosened at the end of the year, then started again. So about 2 years were gone. During that period, elections were held.
Yeah, elections were held. And see, 2021 lockdowns are not like 2020 lockdowns, if you remember. In fact, they refused to impose the lockdown during the second wave in 2021 because there were elections in 5 states. And in Madras, High Court had given a sort of, if you remember, said that the election commission is responsible for the deaths of many people. It issued a sort of verbal sort of warning. So elections were held, surveys were started. So all the NSS surveys got hit, not just because of NRC, but also because of COVID. They resumed sometime in late 2020 itself. And by 2021, everything was in full swing. For particular months between that April to June period, that got affected. And in fact, in neighboring countries, we have also seen. So Nepal, I think, was supposed to hold a census in June 2021, and it got shifted to November 2021. So even a neighboring country, which arguably has lower state capacity than India, was able to conduct it just after a few months. It does not explain the full delay of the census.
So do you think, since you mentioned in the initial stages that there was an attempt to link it with NRC and that provoked the protest, can we say that there was a political reason why it got delayed?
Yeah, if suppose the COVID pandemic had not hit us, it is possible that just because of the house listing thing may not have happened in 2020. Now, because of COVID and this thing happening together, it is very hard to impact of the two things. But we can definitely say that there was political interference in the census process, because once you do that, then the integrity of the data when you go out into the field will anyway be questioned. You get what I'm saying, or is it not clear?
So you put the fear of, a political angle to check people's religion, basically. That's what, and their status in the country. And the whole thing got derailed.
Yeah, so questions about, say, when you have come into a particular place, how long you are residing, especially migration data. That statisticians were always saying that even if this 2021 census happens, we have to take this migration data with a huge doses of salt, because this NRC fear has sort of crept into the minds of people. They're not going to tell you honestly when they have migrated to a particular place, and people are going to lie about it. So particular aspects of the data set might have got compromised in any case.
So one way or the other, COVID, NRC, political interference, as you call it, has derailed it. And now we are seeing a continuous delay. What does that imply?
So, as I said,
what is the status right now, firstly?
Yeah. So, most recent notification came sometime in January, which indicated that even now we don't have a date on when it might even be expected to take place. So, it is an indefinite postponement. So, what happens is 6 months before the house listing phase, all the administrative boundaries of districts are supposed to be frozen. So, the Home Ministry issues a notice or a notification to all the states, and all the district boundaries are frozen. Because if you keep increasing the number of districts, it becomes very difficult to have a census frame to plan the house listing phase. Once these districts are frozen, it is only then that through remote sensing and through physical verification, etc., you should develop a frame, which is basically think of it as a large map, and then disaggregated maps for each state, each district, each block, etc. And once you have that, then you start planning the house listing phase. Once you get the house listing phase data, there's again verification. After that, you start the main phase. So it's a sequential process. And this notification to freeze districts was issued pre-COVID. It was extended repeatedly during COVID because there was no clarity when the lockdowns would end and people would go out of the field. Now they have said that it is indefinitely postponed. So states can go ahead and create new districts and till whenever Home Ministry intervenes, and we don't know when that might happen. So it doesn't look likely that the census is going to happen this year, because you need that gap, you need that 6-month freezing.
Yes.
And then you can really start house listing. And then after a few months, 3-4 months gap, you can have the main census. And you remember 2024, we have the elections coming up when the state machinery will be occupied primarily with that. So it's impossible to conduct a census and a general election together at least. So that is not going to happen. So most likely, and I have heard it from various government officials themselves, that the next census, if it happens, will happen only after 2026.
So you're looking at something that should have happened in 20 and 21 happening in 25, 26 perhaps.
Yes.
This is unprecedented.
This is unprecedented.
How will it affect policies?
It will create a huge problem once the new data comes out, because all your surveys, even national accounts estimation, when they come up with estimates of the unorganized sector, for instance, they use some rough rates and ratios based on past surveys and then multiply it with estimates of the workforce. Those workforce estimates are derived from the census. So all your key socioeconomic statistics are going to go in for a toss. And when the new census data will be plugged in, there will be a huge series of revisions happening everywhere. And that will create a huge chaos, because this will happen after a gap of 15 years. It is supposed to happen after a gap of every 10 years. And now we have, 50% larger lag from 10 years to 15 years in sort of updating this data. And even now, we don't know whether it is going to happen even in 2025. So maybe the next government will come in and take a call on when this will happen. We don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty over that. And also, I think the results of the Bihar caste census may also have bearing on this, because the other reason which we have not talked about so far, why there were sort of questions over the 2021 census, was what are you going to do about caste data? Initially, the government, the Union Home Ministry said that, look, all the planning has been done, all the data users conference was done, we took input suggestion from all ministries, from all the states, every consultation is finished. And the last moment, you cannot impose this caste question on us. And anyway, this question of caste has been considered by previous governments under, over various decades. And every time the answer is that it is administratively very difficult to do. And there's certain logic in that. I'm not questioning that. But when you have a situation where the census is anyway delayed because of the pandemic, and then there is further delay, and meanwhile, you have states, or at least one state, attempting to do a caste census on its own, if it is able to pull it off and it is credible, that data is credible, it will create a huge demand. It will naturally raise the question that if Bihar can do a caste census, why can't India?
And why is the central government against it?
So this resistance to having a caste census predates the BJP government. It has always been there. It's not something new. And there is certain logic to it. And I have some sympathy for that view, because the history of census globally, if you see, is far more traumatic and far more sort of murky compared to the Indian experience. So Indian experience till now has been of uninterrupted run of censuses, which has happened despite World War II, World War I, which was happened despite the pandemic of 1919 and so on. So this is the first time that we are seeing a break. But other than that, from 1872 till 2011, we had an uninterrupted break. That is not the case with many developing countries across the world. In most multi-ethnic societies, the census is a hugely controversial issue. And that is because the census counts of ethnicities often become subjects of manipulation. They have the power to change power equations. Nigeria is a classic example. So the first Nigerian census post-independence was in 1962. And it showed that the northern region, northern Nigeria, the population was much lower than what was anticipated. And this was the dominant region. They were the elites of Nigeria, or basically northern elites. They simply refused to accept it. And then a resurvey was done, which suddenly discovered 9 million additional people in the northern parts. And the equilibrium between the north and the south and the west was restored. And this artificial sort of census formula has existed till now. There have been 3-4 other attempts. Nigeria hasn't had a continuous census structure like India, but there were further attempts, and each round has been questioned, each round has been discredited. So even the current population of Nigeria, that is seriously questioned by development economists, because we don't know if the disaggregated numbers, the way they have evolved, that is a true estimate on. So when you have a question related something like caste, which will then be used for making policy of affirmative action, of changing reservations, etc., you create an incentive for people to distort numbers. And if I may take 2 minutes, I'll give you an example within the Indian context itself. So if you look at Nagaland's 2001 census showed a huge jump in population, and which is why when the 2011 census was conducted, which was a much more accurate account, it showed the only Indian state which reported a drop in the population in 2011 was Nagaland. It was not true. It was an artificial drop, because 2001 census, Nagaland had shown a 65% jump over 1991. And it was an inflated jump. There were a lot of political reasons why that happened. The each sub-district and each district in Nagaland is dominated by a particular tribe which wanted to inflate its numbers. The census enumerators got into their sort of influence, and the entire exercise was sort of jigged. So when there is so much riding on that one particular question, there is chance of statistical corruption. There is reason why why census commissioners of the past have repeatedly resisted putting the caste question after 1931, which was the last time.
But Pramit, the distortions and interference apart, we are at a stage in our development and growth, post-Mandal more so, where caste is now something you can't wish away.
Yes, that is true.
So what Bihar is doing is, of course, a political move. There is no question about it, but it can and should be managed.
Yes, so that is very interesting. I mean, as I said, my views on this are still sort of undecided. If Bihar does manage to pull it off, and the data is credible, people may challenge it in courts, but if the court rules that this is fair, if this data is then seen as something that can be used for policy making, it will naturally raise the question that India should be able to do it as well. Because remember, most states, without any sort of prejudice to Bihar, most states bit higher state capacity than the state of Bihar in many respects. So if Bihar is able to conduct a caste census, it would naturally raise the question, why can't we do it all over the country?
Which will delay the whole process further.
Which could delay the process further, yes.
In recent times, Indian data on many counts, census, let's keep the census aside for the moment, growth, GDP, so many other things there's been a lot of criticism, has not been accepted wholly. Why is this happening?
So, this is something I've been writing about for a long time. And I could talk hours about that, but I don't want to bore your listeners. But just to sort of give a summary, if you look at India's statistical system right from, say, independence era till now, even in the British system, there was a certain effort made to modernize Indian statistics, but it was a half effort, to be very frank. It was only in the sort of post-independent era, with the advent of planning, that you require data at a large scale and you require data of a particular quality. And you had someone like Mahalanobis to set up this system, which sort of became a model for the entire developing world. This NSS style of surveys were later adopted by almost every other developing country in the world. And you had a world-renowned sort of statistical system, say in the 1950s or 70s sort of period. In the post-Mahalanobis era, there were some gradual changes, bureaucratization, disconnect between the world of statistics and research, various other changes in the organization of the statistical machinery, and the very fact that planning process itself sort of got marginalized. That led to a lot of deterioration over time. What has added to that is that the attempts to reform the statistical structure, the statistical organization post-2001, they have not really taken off in the manner in which they were supposed to. So, for instance, there was this felt need that statistics should be in many ways, independent from the rest of the government machinery. And you need an apex body composed largely of outsiders who would set the direction of statistics, who would audit, periodically check and review statistics and ensure that it is not the statistical quality is of a certain standard and is not subject to political manipulation of any kind. But those mechanisms, the National Statistical Commission was set up, but it was not given statutory powers. The National Statistical Commission and the Ministry of Statistics were constantly at loggerheads. And in recent years, there has been an effort to sort of marginalize the National Statistical Commission even further and its powers even on NSS surveys, when it should be released, which survey should be released, which should not be not.
No, but in lay terms, what does it imply that the world does not believe our data? Is this what you're saying?
See, so let me put it this way. We have not reached a stage where it is like Chinese statistics and no one believes it. But it is not at the stage where it was in the Mahalanobis era that this is a world-class statistic and we can take it at face value. Now, there are a lot more questions about Indian data than in the early stages when Indian data were considered to be the gold standard. That is not the case.
But wasn't there an attempt to change the way GDP was presented?
So again, that is a sort of complex issue. The part of it is technical in nature. The changes which were sort of pushed through by Mosby were not sort of accepted by everyone in the advisory committees, and therefore some people objected to it, and there was a debate. It was an academic debate, and that continued. But
internationally,
internationally, once India releases it, other countries have to accept it. There's no other alternative unless IMF comes out and says that this data is wrong. So IMF did come up with a technical report where they said there's some aspects of it need changes, but that technical report was never made public. So although IMF did put pressure on CSO to change the methodology, it was never discussed publicly. IMF did not question it publicly. So that, broadly, there was no resistance to accepting Indian figures officially. But among private investors, among foreign institutional investors, there has been questioning around this. And also because we don't have that kind of an apex body, which almost every other G20 economy has, where it has some system of independent audits, especially of critical data sets like GDP, of IIP, etc. We don't have that kind of provision. So it certainly lowers confidence in Indian statistics. And, we hear this talk about India being replacement to China in the coming years and so on. One of the reasons why one then looks up to India is because of its democracy and because of its openness. But if you have this kind of opacity around your statistics, then increasingly people are going to feel that this is becoming more and more like China. So we have not gone there yet. But the strengths that we have, if we don't build on that, and if we don't open up, if we don't sort of make our statistical systems transparent, then this idea that we can just, zoom to a developed country, I don't think that is feasible.
That's a very interesting point because, you can't have some aspects of wanting to be a developed country and not the others. So we think that the census is going to be delayed indefinitely at the moment.
Yes.
You've explained how it will have an impact. What will it do to, shall we say, the country in general in terms of its social policies? Welfare, for example.
Yeah, so welfare, for instance, the provision of food grains, for instance, that is based on a certain ratio that you give to, say, 75% of the population. But that population, the number of beneficiaries is determined by the center on the basis of 2011. And because your population has grown and there is no official census and you have not updated that, and you can't update that till you have a census, unless you're using some kind of projection. It basically means that millions of people are not able to access those benefits, even though on paper it is supposed to reach 75%. In reality, it is not reaching those people. I think Ritika Chira and John Reyes, they had a paper on this sometime back, where they pointed out how this was affecting millions of beneficiaries across the country. And this is true, of course, at a central level, the main welfare scheme, but this is also true of state level. State level officials have even greater problems because the center still has some sense of what is happening across states through surveys, etc. But states do not have those kind of survey mechanisms to see how one block is faring compared to the other. For them, the census data is invaluable to know where they should redirect welfare programs, where they should redirect certain programs. Unless they have this kind of a comprehensive database, it becomes very difficult, and it is not easy for a state to conduct credible and reliable surveys when they don't have that kind of capacity which an NSS at the central level has.
So this is going to be I won't use the colloquial term, a mess, but certainly going to create problems down the line.
It is already a huge problem.
Yeah, this is not a particularly good thing because politics is not only about elections, it is about processes and institutions.
Yeah.
Well, that was Pramit Bhattacharya explaining to us the problems behind, if at all the census will get further delayed. It was to take place in 2021. Now it doesn't look at the earliest at 24-25, maybe later. Thank you, Pramit, for a wonderful exposition. A bit technical, but I'm sure our interested listeners will follow it.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
We'll be back again next week with another guest. Till then, from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the rest of the Wire Talks team, goodbye.
You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.